Welcome to Church History for Life, a ministry of the Christian Heritage Center. I am Kyle Kirby. I'm the founder of the CHC, pastor for preaching at Grace Fellowship Church in Albion, Illinois. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Tim Hopp. Tim is the pastor of First Baptist Church in Nixon, Missouri, and he's also a board member for the Christian Heritage Center. In each episode of this ministry, in each episode of this podcast, Church History for Life, we consider the lives of historic Christian figures by asking three questions. We ask, who was this person? What are they known for? And how can we learn from them today? And our aim is to connect the past with the present and to make church history both accessible and edifying for the modern believer who listens and hears this. In today's episode, we're going to consider the influential early church figure, church father Jerome, who was significant for his scholarly works and for his efforts and endeavors for the Church of Christ in that day and age. Tim, are you ready to talk about Jerome today?
I am ready.
So am I. For the listeners, we've been trying to do this for several weeks, but technology has not been incredibly supportive of these attempts. But today, it's being cooperative. So today, we will begin with our first question. Who was Jerome?
So Jerome was born in 347 AD. So again, as we're trying to place these dates within these major milestones in church history, 313 was the conversion of Constantine, 314, the Edict of Milan. So widespread persecution, except for a few pockets later on. But the conversion of not only Constantine but the Roman Empire began 30 years before Jerome was born. So he was not born under the shadow of persecution as were earlier fathers. 325 was the Council of Nicaea, where the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity was first laid down in an ecumenical creed. Of course, that would be further crystallized in 381. So he's part of this new generation of fourth century into fifth century church fathers who were born into not yet perhaps a Christianized, but a Christianizing Roman Empire. And he's born into a wealthy Christian family in Stridonia. I would be impressed if anybody knows where Stridonia is. I had to look it up. We might say, well, it's in the region of Dalmatia, and that's where they make spotted dogs. But where's Dalmatia? Well, that's modern day Croatia and Slovenia. So we're talking about the Baltic states. His family sends him to Rome, and he studies all of the classics. He studies Latin, rhetoric, logic, philosophy. He studies at the feet of the famous grammarian Aelius Donatus, and he's planning on becoming a lawyer, working in the imperial courts. Right, he's on the up and up. He's a brilliant student, but we don't know much about his conversion. But something happened that that transitions his life. Something dramatic transpires, and that something dramatic that transpired led to his being baptized and devoting his life to the church. And I might just mention that it is interesting. This is my little Baptist stick that I might put in here, but this is another of the church fathers that was born into a Christian family and yet was not baptized until he was converted as an adult. We saw the same thing with the Cappadocian fathers. This is So I might just say that paedobaptism wasn't as widespread as is often suggested. That's for free, and so any paedobaptist listeners, I plead your forgiveness and urge you to reconsider. At
Listening.
any rate, he is baptized in 370, so at the age of 23, and this leads him to pursue a completely different course. So rather than living the pagan intellectual life, which came much like Augustine, with all of the immorality and all of the luxury that that kind of life afforded, he devotes himself like a pendulum
Mhm.
swing to
Mhm.
a life of ascetic discipline and devotion to the scripture. He travels to the Syrian desert in the year 374, and he's the rest of his life is lived sort of in and out of monasteries,
Mhm.
mostly in monasteries. And so it's in the Syrian desert that he studies and becomes proficient in Hebrew, which was a real rarity in that day.
Mhm.
Most of the church fathers would have taken uh, the Old Testament from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation, but Jerome set his mind to learning the Hebrew language, and this would become very, very important in about 10 years. And
Yeah.
so he spends 4 or 5 years in a monastery in the Syrian desert, and before moving to Antioch. And at Antioch, he becomes a presbyter. He is ordained as a presbyter in the church, and and that really begins his life of service to the church. In the year 381, which is a very significant year in the early church, that's the year of the Council of Constantinople, where the Nicene Creed is reaffirmed and expanded. And so the Nicene Creed that we recite today actually isn't the one that was produced in 325. It's the one that was produced
Mhm.
in 381. And so as our listeners will know from earlier episodes, the battle for the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity was not won at the Council of Nicaea. The Arianism and semi-Arianism made a raging comeback, much to Athanasius's chagrin, in the intervening years, and it was recaptured, and the battle was definitively won at the Council of Constantinople, by and large with the help of the Cappadocian Fathers. And
Mhm.
uh, and so Jerome travels to Constantinople in 381, and he becomes closely acquainted with Gregory of Nazianzus, and he uh they this is where I think that his theology is very much crystallized. He becomes a steadfast proponent of the orthodox Nicene
Mhm.
Christian faith. The next year he travels to Rome, back to Rome, and there he catches the attention of the Pope, and I'm trying to get his Pope Damasus. Uh, and Pope Damasus recognizes his prolific intelligence, his prolific skill, and a gift and a skill that he possesses that almost no one else possesses, that is fluency in Hebrew. And he asks Jerome to prepare a new and improved Latin translation of the Bible from the original languages, from the original, not, you can't say the original manuscripts, but the original
Mhm.
languages. And Jerome agrees to undertake that work. While he is in Rome, he begins to exert just incredible influence. He almost has a magnetic draw. His asceticism, his ascetic lifestyle. It's like you can take the monk out of the monastery, but you can't take the monastery out of the monk. He continues to live that ascetic lifestyle even in Antioch, even in Constantinople, even in Rome, and it begins to attract a following
Mhm.
of the upper class who had been converted out of this lifestyle of luxury and self-indulgence, and
Mhm.
they adopt this ascetic lifestyle, and he becomes like the head of a new monastic movement, a
Mhm.
new monastic order, loosely organized, loosely, informal, but they certainly look to him as their leader. But not he was very bold in his denunciation of the decadent lifestyle of the rich and famous in Rome, and especially of the rich and famous who name the name of Christ in
Mhm.
Rome. And so, in was a few years after, I think it's in 384, uh, Pope Damasus dies, and his protection of Jerome is removed, and so Jerome is forced to flee Rome. The rich and powerful in Rome do not like his regular condemnations of them, and so Jerome flees, and he eventually winds up. He takes a circuitous route. I believe he goes into Gaul at one point,
Mhm.
modern day France. But where he ends up landing in the year 386, and where he would remain for the rest of his life, is in Bethlehem. We know from our study of the New Testament that Bethlehem is just about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. So he is right in the epicenter of uh, the remnants of Jewish Christianity. He's right
Mhm.
in the epicenter of the Holy Land, and that's really where he makes his mark. That's where he plants his flag. In the year 405, he finishes his translation of the Bible from the Hebrew and from the Greek. It is known as the Latin Vulgate, which comes from the Latin word for common. When you hear people speak about the vulgar languages, they don't mean that they don't mean vulgarity in the sense of profanity. They mean that it's the common language, and so this was every bit as influential. A lot of times, I think, especially as Protestants, we write Jerome off as a proto-Catholic, and
Mhm.
there certainly was some of those tendencies in Jerome. But his translation from the original languages into Latin was every bit as important, foundational, and revolutionary as Luther's translation in the 16th century, when he translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into German. This was Latin was the language of the day, and the church needed
Mhm.
an accurate translation, and that's what Jerome provided for them, as accurate as he could. Now, of course, we know that 1,000 years later, Luther took exception with Jerome's translation of repent.
Mhm.
Jerome famously had translated it as do penance, rather than what we would understand metanoia to mean.
Mhm.
And that was important in the establishment of the sacrament of penance. But credit where credit is due, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And we should also remember that Jerome, far from being just a dyed in the wool, he wasn't a 16th century Catholic. He wasn't
Mhm.
an 11th century Catholic. He
Yeah.
was a 4th and 5th century Catholic, in the sense of with the lowercase c. This is before the Roman Catholic Church had been established. He does battle with the Pelagians right
Mm,
alongside Augustine. So he is fighting for the doctrines of grace
mm,
over against the man-centered doctrines of merit that are being promulgated um, by Pelagius,
mhm,
and is involved in a number of other early church controversies on what we would say the right side of those
mm,
controversies. Eventually, he dies in 419, and I think I think I would just close this by saying that his influence really cannot be overstated. There was a
mhm,
reason why we had made it all the way to Cyril of Alexandria in the middle of the
mhm,
fifth century. There's a reason why we felt like we had to go back and pick up Jerome. You can't really understand the history of the church apart from
mhm,
Jerome. Jerome was arguably, but probably the greatest scholar of the first 5 centuries.
mhm. Who do you think he'd be rivaled by in that? Maybe Origin
Yes,
or
Origin and I
mm,
think you could put well, I think Origin is probably those two names. Getting up there would be Justin Martyr, but it's hard to compare them because whole worldviews of thought, Platonism, and that kind of thing.
yeah,
Like there's transitions taking place from generation to generation, and so they just think in different ways. But in terms of sheer output, you remember that Origin left volumes upon volumes upon volumes of commentaries, most of which we don't even have anymore. We know
mm,
about their existence from other writings. Well, that would be similar to Jerome leaving behind an entire Bible that he had
yeah,
translated word for word from the original manuscripts.
mm. Yeah, Tim, I think we talked about this when we were doing Augustine. Um, so in many ways, I feel like, it's hard not to see providence at work in Augustine and in Jerome. Because in Augustine, we see this great theologian, and we see his doctrines and his theology. In many ways, it forms a foundation to carry the church through the Middle Ages, so that the Catholic faith isn't absolutely obliterated.
Right,
But also we see providence at work, I think, in that, we find this accessible and this good translation by Jerome being provided that carries the church through that 1,000-year period as well. And so God provides for his church providentially and gives them a means so that the faith is not obliterated
right.
um, throughout that period.
I think it's important to remember that 1,100 years separate
Yeah.
Jerome from Luther. In
Hmm.
Luther's day, the Bible, the Catholic Church wanted the Bible in Latin because they wanted to control its
Hmm.
interpretation. They wanted only scholars to read and interpret it, and that was their way of guarding doctrine. You can't give the Bible to the common man, and
Hmm.
that's because in Luther's day, only scholars read Latin. In fact, one of the
Hmm.
problems was most of the priests didn't. So the Bible was inaccessible even to them. That was not the case in Jerome's day.
Hmm.
If you read in Jerome's day, you read in Latin or Greek.
Hmm.
And so that's why it was called the Vulgate. It
Hmm.
was the common tongue.
Hmm.
And remained so for centuries upon centuries upon
Yeah.
centuries. It was not until not long actually before Luther that nobody's writing anything in English or
Yeah.
in German or in French. They may be speaking those, but Latin was a more common language than I think we give it credit for. And it's even in Luther's day, but especially in Jerome's day. The problem is that by a transition had taken place, and by Luther's day, the common people, it's not only that they didn't read Latin, they didn't speak Latin. And so they couldn't, not only could they not read, they couldn't hear. That was
Mm.
not the case for Jerome. Even if a church member in Jerome's day couldn't read, they could still hear the word read in their own language.
Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that, Tim. So Tim answered the question, who was Jerome? Now we consider the second question, which we always look at, and that is, what is Jerome known for? And so we've already alluded to these and touched on these. He's known for several things, but most notably, he's known for the Latin Vulgate, which Tim is touched on here. He's most famous for translating the Bible into Latin. Uh, this project that was commissioned by the Pope, he revised the Gospels. He translated most of the Old Testament directly from Hebrew and produced what became the Standard Bible for Christianity for more than 1,000 years, which is really incredible. That's something nobody else did before him, and it's something that nobody else did until what 1100 years later.
Right.
So it's a time-tested work and something that was tremendously useful for the church throughout the entirety of that period. Prior to Jerome's translation, which came to be known as the Vulgate, all Latin translations of the Old Testament were based on the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text. So that was a big deal. Without question, Jerome was a pioneer in this area. He stands out for this. The scriptures translated by Jerome profoundly shaped the medieval church and continued to influence preaching, theology, devotion, liturgy well into the time of the Reformation. This legacy, in many ways, overshadows every other part of his life and his work. But that doesn't mean that he's not known for other things and that there aren't other significant aspects that we should remember. He's also known for his monastic and his ascetic influence. He modeled and often exhorted others toward a life of prayer, discipline, and simplicity. He served as a spiritual advisor to a circle of devout Christian women in Rome and later oversaw monastic communities in Bethlehem. He wrote persuasively on monasticism, celibacy, and the pursuit of holiness. And I think, we've touched on this a time or two, Tim, but, you know, that was the church fathers. This was their way of expressing spirituality, and it was coming from a good motive. So it was coming from a place of wanting to be separate from the world, separate from and not be mastered and not be ruled by the flesh and worldly desires. And so there are so many good things that were bound up in this asceticism and this monasticism that we see in the church fathers. Um, so in Bethlehem, he helped establish and oversee 3 nunneries, one men's monastery connected to his own residence, a pilgrim's house for travelers, a school for children, and a church in related ministries. So in many ways, he wasn't just a scholar. He wasn't just a translator, but he was an organizer as well. And he was a gifted leader, it seems, and he was a gifted teacher of others. He set an example. One thing we think back, I think it was Athanasius, and some of this I think is tied to legend, but but I think there's also an element of in Athanasius we saw this deep, deep, almost tangible piety and spirituality that people recognized. And it's described in some of those legends as an aura almost. And I think what they're trying to demonstrably characterized is his spirituality
Mhm.
and the spiritual influence that the Spirit of God works in and through that man. And so I think we see that same thing in Jerome, this deep spiritual life that manifests itself in and through him, because the Spirit of God was so actively at work in and through him. It was almost tangible. And it resulted in people being drawn to the man. It resulted in people taking note of the man, because there was something more than just the man at work in the life of Jerome. Um, so his monastic vision was fueled by a deep desire for holiness, for separation from worldliness, um, themes that marked his entire life and his writings. But he's also, I think we have to make note and recognize that he's known for his biblical scholarship and prolific, influential writing. And so we've already touched on these. So he wasn't simply a translator. He wasn't simply a biblical scholar. He compared the Greek manuscripts um, and the New Testament. He consulted the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and he evaluated variant readings, something almost unheard of in that day and that age in the Western Church.
He's doing
He,
he's doing text criticism,
yeah, it's remarkable.
right?
So he's critically thinking about these manuscripts and these texts, and he's letting those things inform his translation and his understanding of theological concepts. I mean, we have to think that all of those things influenced his understanding of the Catholic faith or the Nicene orthodoxy of that day. Um, and so he's a man who's pioneering in many ways. He's ahead of his time in many ways. Um, so he also wrote extensive biblical commentaries on numerous books of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. And so next to Augustine, Jerome stands as one of the most prolific writers in the history of the church from this period, at least. He produced vast body of letters, biblical commentaries, treatises, translations, and polemical works as well. And these were gathered into volumes later on. So he's known for three things: the Vulgate, he's known for his monastic and ascetic influence, and he's known for his biblical scholarship and his prolific, influential writing. So, Tim, you have any other comments on this before we move to our next question?
Well, you have in your notes that I think it's interesting that his translation work in service of the church went beyond the Bible to
Uh,
translating earlier church fathers
mm,
who are writing in Greek and translating that into Latin. So he's not only providing the church with a usable, more accurate biblical translation, but also the resources to help them rightly interpret the
mm,
scriptures. His influence is incalculable.
mm,
So, so what can we learn from Jerome? I wrote down two things. The one, and I don't want to sound like a broken record on this, but I do want to touch on his asceticism one more time. As you mentioned, Kyle, his asceticism was not driven by a desire to earn merit with God by denying himself. It was his way of rejecting an evil world.
mhm,
It was his way of guarding himself from the temptations of Satan and the desires of his sinful flesh. It is not uncommon and not entirely unhealthy when people who are converted out of decadent, luxurious, lascivious
mm,
lifestyles to make such a radical change.
Mhm.
So I think in our 500 years, and this has been the case for 500 years, in our
Mhm.
post-Reformation mindset, we often look at monks and those with monastic tendencies, and impute to them
Cute to them and kind.
a kind of works righteousness, right?
Mhm.
That's what they're pursuing. That's what they're after. I don't I don't think that's fair. And yet it definitely could tend in that direction. It does lay the
Lay the
groundwork for
groundwork
that.
for that.
And so if I were to I would state it this way. It was a helpful means and can be a
Mhm,
helpful means of rejecting the world, the flesh, and the devil, and
Mhm.
that's good. But often what happened in the monastic movement, and I think still happens today, in sort of neo-monasticism, is there's also a rejection. There's a rejection of the world, but there's also a rejection of those things which God created to be enjoyed, a
Mhm.
rejection of God's good gifts. And so
Mhm.
as we try to learn, pull out the good and leave behind the bad, pull out the helpful and leave behind the unhelpful, I would say that,
Mhm.
absolutely reject the world, the flesh, and the devil, and do so with vigor. But
Mhm.
don't reject those good gifts that God created to be enjoyed with thanksgiving because they're made holy by the word of God in prayer. I'm thinking First Timothy
Yeah.
chapter 4. Um, but the primary thing that we can learn from Jerome is the importance
the
of
importance of
scholarship in the church.
scholarship in the church.
Mhm.
Not everybody
Not
is called to learn Hebrew and Greek. Not everybody is called to the arduous task of translation. Not everybody is called to be a scholar, a teacher of the church, a doctor of the church, as they would have called them in the medieval church and in the even into the Reformation. But some are, and
Mhm.
they are essential. So, Calvin recognized this as he was dreaming up an ideal community in Geneva. You remember that he had a fivefold office
Mhm.
for his church, and one of those was teachers, which he by which he meant not only those who are teaching in the pulpit, but it's hard to
Mhm.
say how those are different from pastors. Primarily, I think he's talking about those who are bringing to the church a better understanding of the faith, right? They're doing the hard work of interpreting the text, writing commentaries for the church, training pastors for the church, um, doing battle with threats
Mhm.
that will emerge that from both from within and outside the church, and that is always needed. The
Mhm.
church needs scholars. The
Mhm.
church needs theologians
Mhm.
because they equip the church to stand in every age. And so,
Mhm.
in that sense, I think Jerome stands as a model of
Mhm.
someone who does scholarship for the church. He didn't do
Yeah.
it to get wealthy. He didn't do it to get famous. He was gifted and recognized that he was gifted with a prolific intellect, and he employed that intellect to help the church to stand and to grow.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I would like to leave it. We need,
Mhm.
even though it's not for most of us,
Mhm.
we need scholars, and those scholars, they need to be supported. Which
Mhm.
is why, in my particular tradition, we have seen that it's necessary to um, to endow seminaries and institutions of higher education. We need to continue to fund and to funnel resources and energies into maintaining a high level of evangelical reformational scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good. I think that's a good application point, because uh, churches need to support scholarship,
Mhm.
and believers need to support scholarship. And what are some ways they do that? One, they encourage young men
Right.
to go to seminary and to study and to, but they also, I think that parents and pastors and churches can help individuals clarify their gifts and their callings,
Mhm.
and support them financially, and don't be against and opposed to those things. I think that's a really really good exhortation that you're
Well,
saying, Tim.
churches can
Churches
do
can
for
do for
young men what
young men what
Damasus did for Jerome, right?
Mm,
Recognize his talent, recognize his
yeah.
intellect, and engage him in helping the church, right?
Mm,
And I think we can do the same thing.
amen. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Church History for Life. We hope that this has been edifying and encouraging, informative for your own soul. Tim, do you have any closing words before we close up here?
Cole lege, right?
That's right.
Uh,
Take up
I
and read.
take up and read. That's
that's
the voice
the
that
voice
Augustine
that
heard in the
Augustine heard
garden,
Mhm.
that caused him to
that
take up
caused
the
him to take
scriptures,
the
and
scripture.
I would
I
say that Jerome would probably echo that sentiment, right? And
sentiment,
when
right? Or
someone
when
gives their whole
someone
life
gives their whole life
to translate the Bible, they do that so that
so that
it'll be read.
that will
So
be read.
uh,
That's right.
so let's make use. Let's make use of the
Let's make use
scholarship
of the scholarship.
that God has provided through the teachers that He's raised up.
That's right. Until next time, friends, let's continue to honor, preserve, and learn from the heritage of godly figures in the past to better serve the church today. Thanks so much, and blessings.